Alright, here we go with our video lecture for chapter number 16. We're looking at the Americas in the early modern era, also known as the colonial period. Sometimes we call it the colonial period because the Americas will be colonized by the Europeans during this time period. Now, before they start colonizing the Americas, the Europeans begin exploring the Indian and the Atlantic Oceans starting in the 1400s, right? At the end of the post-classical and the beginning of the early modern era, time period 3 and time period 4. Now, the main goal is to go to China, go to the East. That's India, China, Southeast Asia. That's what the Europeans called the East, or the Far East. And that is the source of all the luxury goods that the Europeans had been craving for, spices and silk and sugar and other goods that the Europeans wanted. So the problem was that to get those goods, they would have had to purchase them through the Ottoman Empire and the Venetians. So all these goods, whether they're being transported through the Silk Road or they're being transported through the Indian Ocean, had to go through the Ottoman Empire, which was settled right here in the Eastern Mediterranean, or they had to go through the Venetians right here in Italy. So that means by the time that these luxury goods made their way to Europe, they tend to have the prices hiked up very high, made it very, very expensive. So the Europeans, some Europeans, particularly the Portuguese, the Spanish, they decided that they want to have a direct trade network, direct trade route to the east. And some of them, the Portuguese, for example, they're going to start figuring out, well, why don't we just sail around Africa, right? And at this time, the Europeans will have developed the technology to do so, to sail around Africa, sail across the Atlantic Ocean, because over the previous time period 3, all this maritime technology had been diffused from the east, from the Middle East into Europe. So this technology will allow the Europeans to build these type of ships called the caravels, right, which allow them to sail across the open sea. So the Europeans are going to sail around Africa, make their way to the east. Columbus and others are going to make their way west across the Atlantic in discovering the New World. Keep in mind that besides looking for gold and looking for wealth and looking for glory and looking for resources, the Europeans are also going to be motivated to spread the Christian faith, especially the Iberian Europeans, that is Spain and Portugal. And of course the Europeans are going to have this technological advantage of advanced gunpowder technology, because as the Europeans, once they were able to acquire this technology, they improved upon it because they're constantly fighting each other, constantly going to war against each other, and using this advanced technology is going to give them an advantage. Now the Europeans, we're going to see that the first use of African slaves take place here during this time period. So what starts happening is that these little islands called the Azores Islands and the Canary Islands, right, they will be colonized, they will be settled by the Portuguese and the Spanish. And these islands in the middle of the Atlantic, they have the perfect climate for sugar cultivation. So the Europeans love their sugar, and it is a profitable crop because there's a high demand for it. So the Europeans are going to start having slave plantations, sugar plantations, setting them up in these little islands. And then they're going to go to North Africa and purchase slaves. And of course, these slaves originally would have come from West Africa, and they would have been transported across the Trans-Saharan trade network and then sold off and sent to these islands. So this kind of like the very first baby step into what will become the Atlantic slave trade. So it starts here in these little islands, and the Portuguese and the Spanish are the first ones to do this. Later on, we're going to see that the Europeans are going to go, they're going to ignore, they're going to bypass the Trans-Saharan trade network and go directly into the coast of Africa to purchase slaves. Now, when the Europeans make their way to the Americas, we're going to see that European culture, American culture, Native American, indigenous culture, and African culture are going to start interacting with each other, kind of creating this brand new, what we will call American or Latin American culture. But the dominant one of these, of course, is going to be the European culture, because the Europeans are the ones doing the conquering. Right? The native populations are going to die out mainly because of disease, and those that survive the diseases will be enslaved or forced to work, and therefore their culture is going to be suppressed. It's going to be kept down. It's going to be banned. The Europeans are going to say that you cannot practice your old religion, your old traditions. You cannot speak your old languages. You have to convert to the European culture. But again, like as I mentioned before, these three elements of Native American, African, and European are going to mix and blend in different ways in different parts of the Americas to create a new multicultural culture, right, that we will call American culture. And this is a big synchronization of it. Now, all of this, of course, occurs because of the Columbian Exchange, which is arguably the most important event in world history. Why is it so important, you ask? Because before the Columbian Exchange, right, we see that the world was not integrated, right? The Americas and Oceania was separated from Afro-Eurasia, right, developing in isolation. But after the Columbian Exchange, we see that these worlds are going to combine. They're going to collide. They're going to mix and blend and have good and bad results as a result, as an effect. So this is the Columbian Exchange. And what is the Columbian Exchange, you ask? It is the exchange of plants and animals and people and diseases, right, between the old world, which is the Eastern Hemisphere, that's Africa, Europe, and Asia, and the New World, or the Western Hemisphere, which is North and South America. Right, so here is a long list of all the goods, all the crops, all the stuff that was traded back and forth, that was exchanged back and forth along the Columbian Exchange. Now, animals played a big part. So a lot of animals that never existed in the Americas were brought over by the Europeans. Stuff like cows and chickens and pigs, and most importantly, horses, right? And the Americans, right, the Native Americans are going to slowly start adopting these animals and using these animals for labor, right, which is something that they never had before. Of course, they also used them for food. Now, what animals went to the old world? Well, turkeys is probably the most important one, but also the llama made its way to Africa, Europe, and Asia. But these two animals, again, they're minor importance, right? These animals going from the old world to the new are way more important. Now, when it comes to crops, we see that European crops like rice and wheat and citrus, right? All these crops that had come into Europe from other parts of the world, the Europeans are going to transplant them and start cultivating them in the Americas, right? Creating a more diverse diet for those people in the Americas. Now, other crops that the Europeans brought would be cash crops, stuff that you grow in order to make a profit. And the two most important ones are going to be sugar and coffee. Now, when it comes to cash crops, the Europeans are going to fall in love with tobacco, and they're going to start cultivating that as well. But tobacco is not a old world crop. It is actually a new world crop, and it's going to be grown in vast numbers in the throughout the Americas, right? North America and Latin America. Now, what crops went to the old world, you ask? Mainly it's going to be corn and potatoes. Corn or maize from Mesoamerica, potatoes from the Andean region of South America, right? These two major crops are going to make their way to Europe, to Africa, to Asia, blending with their diet, with their food, and the populations are going to increase big time. Now, all these new crops and animals coming into the new world is going to lead to environmental degradation, right? Damaging of the environment. The main thing would happen is that the Europeans would completely clear out forests, native forests, in order to make room for plantations. Also, the Europeans would use the same land for cash crops and grow the same crop, like sugar, every year over and over and over and over. And the problem with that is that that leads to soil erosion, right? When you grow the same crop over and over, you don't do any rotation, crop rotation, then you're going to have soil erosion where the nutrients of the soil are going to be depleted. Now, the Columbian Exchange is going to have massive demographic, that's population shifts, changes, both in the Americas and in the Old World. Now, the most dramatic one is the death of over 100 million people, right, in about a time period of 300 years, 1500 to 1800, right, throughout the early modern era. And these are going to be found in the Americas, right, the New World, and also Oceania. Some places are going to hit extremely bad. The Aztec Empire is going to collapse during this time, when about 95% of the population dies within 100 years or so, or 200 years, because of diseases, right? Diseases brought over by Europeans. Now, why was it that the Europeans had these deadly diseases, and why were the Americans, the Native Americans, the indigenous Americans, why were they so vulnerable to these diseases? Well, the problem is domesticated animals. Remember, in the Americas, besides the llamas, there are no major domesticated animals, and having domesticated animals, right, brings a lot of diseases to human populations. So the populations of Europe, Africa, and Asia who had cattle, had horses, had camels, had goats, had sheep, and these animals would have spread their diseases to the human populations, right? And those humans would have gotten sick and died, but then other humans would have survived and developed an immunity, and this immunity would, be passed down generation to generation. And by the time, we get to the 1400s, 1500s, the Europeans had developed a lot of resistance against their own diseases, right? Remember, the Black Death killed millions and millions of people, but those who survived, had grown up with a resistance against this same disease. But in the Americas, they never developed that resistance because they never had animals to, contract the diseases from. So when the time the Europeans show up and they bring in smallpox and they bring in other diseases, the American, the immune system of the people of the Americas couldn't handle it. It was a brand new foreign disease, kind of like aliens coming in with their diseases. There's no way we can resist it because our human, biological system isn't built for that, isn't built for something so strange, so foreign, so distant. And that's exactly what happens to the population of the Americas, right? They lack the immunity, and therefore they're going to die in giant numbers. Now, even though the population of the Americans, right, indigenous Americans, is going to drop big time, worldwide, the population is actually going to increase, right? Because of the Columbian Exchange, we see that population around the world is going to increase big time. More food, more surplus, better diet, more population. Now, we also need to mention that the Columbian Exchange is also movement of people, and sometimes people weren't, didn't choose to migrate, they were forced to migrate, and that's exactly what happens to about 12 million Africans who are going to be enslaved and transported across the Atlantic Ocean in the transatlantic slave trade during this time period. All right, so that's it for our very first part. Thank you for watching, thank you for listening, thank you for learning, and I'll see you next time when we talk about the conquest of the New World.